Welcome to Night Crime Stories. Tonight, we examine the case of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist. 13 masterpieces vanished in 81 minutes, and after 3 decades, the empty frames still hang where the paintings once were. Settle in, turn off the lights, and let the case unfold. Opening meditation. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a northern English city in the early summer. The long light of June stretches across the rooftops well into the evening. Children play in the streets until their mothers call them in. The sound of a ball against a brick wall. The smell of someone's supper drifting from an open window. Life, ordinary and unremarkable, continuing in the way it always has. It is in that kind of quiet that the most disturbing things can happen. Not in darkness. Not in isolation. But right there, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, while the world continues around the edges of something that should be impossible. Tonight we are going to spend a long time with a case from 1968. A case from Newcastle upon Tyne, in the north of England. A case that has been written about extensively, analyzed by psychiatrists, debated by legal scholars, and revisited by journalists for more than 50 years. And yet there is a dimension of this case that still does not receive the attention it deserves. A dimension that was hidden from the court. Hidden from the psychiatrists. Hidden, in some ways, from history itself. We will move slowly tonight. There is a great deal to understand, and the understanding requires patience. It requires a willingness to sit with uncomfortable questions. Not questions about guilt, the question of guilt was settled long ago. But questions about cause. About context. About what we owe to the truth of a child's life, even when that child has done something that seems utterly beyond comprehension. Take a breath. Settle in. We are going to stay with this for a while. Part 1, The City and the Summer. What does it mean for a place to be a backdrop to something terrible? Newcastle upon Tyne in 1968 was a city in transition. The great industries that had defined it for generations, the shipyards, the coal mines, the iron works, were beginning to decline. The working-class communities that had grown up around those industries were changing too. Some neighborhoods were being cleared for redevelopment. Others were being left behind, their housing stock aging, their streets a little shabbier than they had been in the years just after the war. The Scotswood area of Newcastle, where much of this story takes place, was one of those left-behind places. Rows of terraced houses. Children playing in the street because there was nowhere else particularly inviting to play. Small corner shops. A day nursery on Woodland Crescent. Patches of wasteland where old buildings had been demolished. The kind of neighborhood that people in other parts of the city didn't think about very much. It was also, by any honest account, a community. Families knew each other. Children ran in and out of each other's houses. Mothers watched the street from their front steps. There was a web of connection, however frayed, holding the neighborhood together. Which is partly why what happened was so difficult to process. Because it happened inside that web. It happened between people who knew each other's names. The summer of 1968 was a summer of global upheaval. In Paris, students were building barricades. In America, Martin Luther King had been shot in April and Robert Kennedy would be shot in June. The Prague Spring was approaching its violent end. The world was loud with the sound of things changing, things breaking, things being contested. In Scotswood, none of that registered very loudly. What registered, that summer, was something much smaller in scale and much more intimate in its horror. Two small boys. An 11-year-old girl. And a sequence of events that the British legal system would struggle to categorize for decades afterward. The girl at the center of this story was born in May 1957. She grew up in the Scotswood neighborhood. She was small for her age. She had a particular quality that people who knew her would later describe in different ways. Some said she was charming, some said she was strange, some said she could be aggressive, some said she was unusually intelligent. The truth, as we will come to understand, is that she was all of those things simultaneously, and that each of those qualities was shaped by something that was happening to her, privately, invisibly, in ways that no one outside her home fully understood. Her mother was a woman named Betty Bell. And Betty Bell is, as one researcher who spent years with this case put it, the figure you cannot stop thinking about once you learn what she was doing. But we are not ready for that part of the story yet. We need to understand the sequence of events first. We need to understand what the world saw, before we can understand what the world did not see. The first death occurred in May 1968. A 4-year-old boy named Martin Brown. He lived with his family in White House Road, a short walk from the wasteland and the terrace streets of the area. He was, by all accounts, a lively, ordinary 4-year-old. The kind of child who is everywhere and nowhere in particular, moving through the summer afternoon on no particular errand except the errand of being 4 years old. On the afternoon of May 25, 1968, Martin walked to a local sweet shop. He bought a piece of candy. He started walking back. He never arrived home. About 15 minutes after he left the shop, 3 older boys, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, climbed into an abandoned house on St. Margaret's Road. They were looking for scrap wood, the kind of thing children collected in those days for various projects and games. The house was empty and derelict. It was the kind of place children were warned to stay away from, which was, of course, part of its appeal. They found Martin on the floor of an upstairs bedroom. He was lying on his back. His arms were above his head. There was blood and saliva running from the corner of his mouth. A workman nearby attempted CPR. It was already too late. The police and ambulance were called. Martin Brown was taken to hospital, where he was pronounced dead. He was 4 years old. Now here is the first thing that does not fit. The first detail that should have changed everything, and didn't. The pathologist who examined Martin Brown the following day was a man named Bernard Knight. Knight was not an ordinary pathologist. He would go on to become one of the most respected forensic pathologists in the United Kingdom, a man who wrote textbooks that are still studied in medical schools today. He was experienced. He was thorough. He was good at his job. And Bernard Knight could not determine a cause of death. He could not find any obvious sign of violence on Martin's body. The marks were there, we know now that they were there, but they were subtle. Too subtle for the examination that was conducted. And so the official record of Martin Brown's death was, in essence, a formal acknowledgement of uncertainty. A child had died. The cause was not determined. Life went on. Martin Brown was buried. The cause of death on his record was something that amounted, in the language of officialdom, to nothing in particular. In reality, he had been strangled. And the person who had strangled him was so small, and so controlled in the way she had done it, that the marks left on his body were too faint for the forensic examination to catch. This is not a criticism of Bernard Knight. It is a statement about the nature of what had happened. A child had committed this act. And the traces of a child's hands are not the same as the traces of an adult's hands. What we are left with, in the immediate aftermath of Martin Brown's death, is a community that did not know a murder had occurred. The police did not know. The family did not know. The neighborhood did not know. They knew only that a 4-year-old boy had died, inexplicably, in an abandoned house. Which was sad. Which was wrong. But which was, in the official view, not a crime. Part 2, The Notes. What does it mean when someone tells you exactly what happened, and you choose not to believe them? 2 days after Martin Brown's funeral, something happened that should have changed everything. The local day nursery on Woodland Crescent was broken into overnight. The method of entry was unusual. Whoever had done it had peeled slate tiles from the roof in order to get inside. This was not the work of an adult burglar. An adult looking to break into a building does not typically climb onto the roof and remove tiles by hand. This was the work of children. Small, determined children, willing to go to considerable effort to get inside. Once inside, the intruders smeared ink and poster paint across the floor. They caused the kind of damage that suggested not vandalism for its own sake, but some kind of frantic, disorganized activity. As though they had needed to be in there. As though being in there had served some purpose that only they understood. And they left notes. 4 handwritten notes, scattered around the building, written in childish printing. The handwriting alternated between 2 different hands. 2 children had been writing, taking turns, or perhaps writing different notes separately. The notes were brief. They were clear. And they were, in their content, among the most extraordinary things the Newcastle police had encountered. The first note read, "I murder so that I may come back." The second, "We did murder Martin Brown." The third, "Watch out, there are murderers about." The fourth note has been described and reproduced in various forms over the years. Its content was consistent with the others, a declaration, a taunt, an acknowledgement of something terrible. Now, take a moment with these notes. They were written in clear handwriting. Handwriting that any document examiner could analyze. They named a specific victim, Martin Brown, a child who had died 2 days earlier in circumstances that were, officially, unexplained. They used the plural. "We did murder Martin Brown." Not I. We. 2 children. 2 different handwriting styles on the same set of notes, in a building that had been entered by removing roof tiles, a method of entry that suggested small, agile bodies. And the Newcastle police concluded that this was a sick prank by older children. They installed a burglar alarm at the nursery. They moved on. They did not connect the notes to Martin Brown's death, because Martin Brown's death was not, officially, a murder. And you cannot investigate a murder that has not been recognized as a murder. This is not presented here as a condemnation of the police. They were working with what they had. What they had was a death with no determined cause, and 4 notes that seemed to claim responsibility for that death, written in a style that read as attention-seeking. The conclusion they reached, that this was a prank, was not unreasonable given what they knew. But it was wrong. And the wrongness of it would cost another child his life 9 weeks later. 2 days after the notes were written, so, for days after Martin Brown's funeral, an 11-year-old girl from the neighborhood knocked on the front door of Martin Brown's family home. Martin's mother, a woman named June Brown, opened the door. The girl smiled at her. And she asked if she could see Martin. June Brown told her that Martin was dead. The girl, still smiling, said, "Oh, I know he's dead. I wanted to see him in his coffin." June Brown closed the door. There is something in that exchange that is very difficult to hold. The smile. The directness. The absence of any pretense of normal social behavior around death and grief. An 11-year-old child, standing on the doorstep of a dead boy's mother, asking to see the coffin. Smiling. It is tempting to read that moment as evidence of something monstrous. And that reading is not entirely wrong. But it is also incomplete. Because there is a context for that smile. There is a history behind that face. And we will spend a great deal of time tonight trying to understand that history. For now, it is enough to note that June Brown closed the door, and the girl walked away, and no one did anything with that exchange, because there was nothing, officially, to do. Part 3, Brian Howe. How do you investigate a crime that the record says didn't happen, while a second crime is already in motion? 9 weeks passed. In those 9 weeks, the summer deepened. Children continued to play in the streets of Scotswood. The nursery that had been broken into and left with notes continued to operate. Martin Brown remained buried in an official category of inexplicable death. The notes remained unconnected to any crime. And an 11-year-old girl continued to move through the neighborhood, visible and invisible simultaneously, watched and unwatched, known and unknown. We know, from later accounts, that she was not idle during those 9 weeks. She was playing with other children, getting into fights, being aggressive at times and charming at other times. She was noticed, and not noticed. She existed in that particular social space that troubled children often occupy, present enough to be familiar, difficult enough to be avoided, not quite dangerous enough to trigger any formal response. On July 31, 1968, a 3-year-old boy named Brian Howe stepped out of his front door to play. He was last seen in his street with his older sister, the family dog, and the girl who would later be identified as responsible for his death. He was small, and trusting, and 3 years old. He had the particular confidence of a child who has never had a reason not to trust the world. Brian Howe was found on a patch of waste ground near his home later that evening. He had been strangled. But this time, there was more. This time, the examination of the body revealed something that the examination of Martin Brown's body had not. There were marks on Brian's throat. Clear enough, now, to be recognized. There were also other marks. Small marks on his legs. Marks made, it appeared, with a pair of scissors. His hair had been partially cut and pressed into the soft ground near where he lay. The forensic team found something that would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the investigation: a set of footprints. Small footprints. A child's footprints. Brian Howe had been murdered. And this time, there was no ambiguity about it. The Newcastle police now had a very serious problem. They had 2 deaths, though they were only certain about one of them at this point, in the same neighborhood, within 9 weeks of each other. They had notes claiming responsibility for the first death that they had dismissed as a prank. They had a community that was frightened, and rightfully so. And they had very little to go on in terms of suspects. Detective Chief Superintendent James Dobson was placed in charge of the investigation. Dobson was an experienced officer. He recognized immediately that the footprints near Brian Howe's body were significant. The size of those prints suggested a very small person. Not an adult. Possibly not even a teenager. The investigation began the way investigations of this kind always begin, by talking to everyone who might have seen anything. Door to door. Street by street. Who had seen Brian that afternoon? Who had been on the waste ground? Who had seen the children playing near that area? And here the investigation ran into something unexpected. Because when detectives began interviewing children from the neighborhood about what they had seen, the responses were varied and sometimes contradictory. Children are not reliable witnesses, for a number of reasons. They are easily influenced, they may not understand the significance of what they've seen, they may be afraid to tell the truth, and they may, in some cases, be actively deceiving the adults asking the questions. One child, however, stood out immediately. Not because she seemed frightened. Not because she seemed upset. But because of the way she talked about what had happened. She was calm. She was detailed. She was, in some ways, remarkably helpful. She offered information that she should not have had. She described aspects of the scene that had not been made public. And she kept returning to the subject, in conversations with neighbors and police alike, with an intensity that went beyond normal childhood curiosity. She was 11 years old. And her name was Mary Bell. Part 4, The Investigation Turns. What does it tell us when the most composed person in a murder investigation is the one who shouldn't know anything at all? The investigation into Brian Howe's death moved quickly once detectives began to focus their attention on the children of the neighborhood. This was not because there was any early certainty about what had happened. It was because the pattern of what children were saying, and what they were not saying, began to form a shape. Mary Bell was not the only child of interest in the early stages of the investigation. There was another girl, a 13-year-old named Norma Bell, no relation, who lived nearby and was Mary's closest companion. The 2 girls were frequently together. They had been seen together on the afternoon Brian Howe disappeared. And when detectives began separating the various threads of testimony from neighborhood children, both names appeared repeatedly. Norma Bell was, in many ways, the opposite of Mary in terms of how she presented to the world. Where Mary was controlled, Norma was anxious. Where Mary seemed almost unbothered by the weight of what was being discussed, Norma showed the kinds of signs that people expect from someone who is frightened, or guilty, or both. Detective Chief Superintendent Dobson authorized a systematic series of interviews with both girls. These were conducted at the police station, with appropriate caution given the age of the subjects. And in those interviews, a picture began to emerge. Mary, when asked where she had been on the afternoon of Brian's death, gave a confident and detailed account. She had been here, then there, then somewhere else. She mentioned specific people, specific times, specific locations. The account was smooth. Almost too smooth. It had the quality of something that had been prepared, rather than something that was being recalled. She also, in the course of those interviews, made statements that she should not have been able to make. Statements about the position of Brian's body. Statements about specific details of the scene that had not been released to the public. When gently challenged on how she knew these things, she did not become flustered. She simply redirected. She offered another explanation. She kept talking. Norma, by contrast, was less composed. And in her lack of composure, she eventually began to tell a different story. A story in which she had been present. A story in which she had watched something happen. A story in which the person doing the watching was Norma, and the person doing the terrible thing was someone else. The investigation now had two suspects. 111, 113. Both girls. Both from the same neighborhood. Both connected to both deaths. A decision was made to search the homes of both girls. This was done carefully and legally, with the appropriate warrants and authorities. In Norma Bell's home, nothing significant was found. In Mary Bell's home, the search turned up items that would become part of the evidence in the eventual prosecution. Small things. Unremarkable in isolation. Significant in context. The forensic evidence from Brian Howe's body was, by this point, being analyzed carefully. The marks on his throat were consistent with the hands of a small person, the finger spacing, the pressure pattern, all of it pointed to someone significantly smaller than an adult. The other marks on his body, the cuts, the partial removal of hair, were puzzling. They suggested something beyond the act of strangulation itself. Something that had happened after death, or perhaps during the process. Something that looked, to the forensic analysts and to the detectives, like a display. Like a statement of some kind. The footprints near the body had been cast in plaster. They were compared to the shoes of various children who had been in the area. The comparison was not conclusive in itself, but it was consistent with a particular size of foot. The size of an 11-year-old girl's foot. Mary Bell was arrested, along with Norma Bell, on August 6, 1968. A week after Brian Howe's death. Both were taken into custody and formally charged. Mary was charged with both murders, the murder of Martin Brown, whose death was now being reconsidered in light of everything that had emerged, and the murder of Brian Howe. Norma was charged in connection with Brian Howe's death. The trial would not take place for several months. In the meantime, the two girls were held in secure accommodation, and the process of preparation for what would become one of the most unusual trials in British legal history began. Part 5, The Trial. What does a courtroom do with a child who does not behave like a child is supposed to behave in a courtroom? The trial of Mary Bell and Norma Bell opened in December 1968 at Newcastle Assizes. The presiding judge was Mr. Justice Cusack. The case was prosecuted by the Crown and defended by counsel appointed for each girl separately, because their interests were not identical and could potentially conflict. Both defendants were children. One was 11 at the time of the crimes, now 12. The other was 13, now 14. This was not a situation the British legal system was well equipped to handle. The courts had dealt with child defendants before, but not under circumstances quite like these, and not with a defendant who presented the way Mary Bell presented. From the first day, observers in the courtroom noted something about Mary. She was composed. She followed the proceedings with visible attention. She occasionally smiled. She did not appear, to the casual observer, to be a child in distress. She appeared to be a child who was interested in what was happening. As though the proceedings were something she was watching rather than something she was part of. This presentation caused difficulties at several levels simultaneously. For the jury, it was deeply disorienting. The expectation, even the unconscious expectation, is that a child who has done something terrible will show signs of remorse, or fear, or distress. Mary showed none of these things in a consistent way. She could be cooperative and she could be defiant. She could be quiet and she could be voluble. But she was rarely what the court expected a child in her position to be. The prosecution's case was built on several pillars. The forensic evidence from Brian Howe's body. The footprint evidence. The statements made by witnesses, including Norma Bell, whose testimony was complex and at times contradictory, but which placed Mary at or near the scene. The statements Mary herself had made during police interviews, which contained information she should not have possessed. And the notes. The notes from the nursery on Woodland Crescent. The 4 handwritten notes that the police had initially dismissed as a prank. Those notes were now subject to forensic document examination, and the examination produced conclusions that the court found significant. The handwriting in the notes was consistent with that of Mary Bell and Norma Bell. Not conclusively, not to a mathematical certainty, but consistent. And the content of the notes, the specific claim that Martin Brown had been murdered, written 2 days before anyone else was treating his death as a murder, was, in context, deeply incriminating. The defense case was complicated by the nature of the defendant. Mary Bell's counsel attempted to argue that the evidence was insufficient, and that the circumstances of the case, particularly the difficulty of establishing precisely what had happened to Martin Brown, meant that the jury should not convict on that count. The defense also explored Mary's background to some degree, presenting evidence about the environment in which she had grown up. But here we encounter the most significant gap in the entire proceedings. A gap that would not be fully understood for decades. For psychiatrists had been appointed by the court to evaluate Mary Bell. They spent time with her. They conducted formal assessments. They produced reports. And those reports, presented to the court, contained a diagnosis that would follow Mary Bell through every subsequent discussion of this case. The psychiatrists diagnosed her as a psychopath. Now, psychopathy, as a clinical concept, has evolved considerably since 1968. The understanding of what it means, what causes it, how it manifests in children, and how it interacts with trauma and environment, has changed enormously. But in 1968, psychopathy was understood primarily as a fixed characteristic of the individual. Something you were. Not something that had happened to you. And all four psychiatrists arrived at this diagnosis without knowing something that was central to who Mary Bell was and how she had come to be that way. Something that had been happening to her since she was 4 years old. Something that the court, the psychiatrists, the jury, and the public were never told. We will come to that. But first, the verdict. On December 17, 1968, after a trial lasting 3 weeks, the jury returned their verdicts. Mary Bell was found guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility in both cases. Not murder, manslaughter. The jury accepted that her mental state at the time of the offenses was such that the full charge of murder was not appropriate. Norma Bell was acquitted on all charges. The verdict of manslaughter rather than murder was the jury's acknowledgement that something was not right with Mary Bell. That she was not simply a child who had chosen to do terrible things. That there was something, they could not name it precisely, but there was something, that had to be taken into account. Mr. Justice Cusack sentenced Mary Bell to detention for life, to be held at Her Majesty's pleasure, a sentence designed for young offenders that meant she would be reviewed periodically and could be released when the authorities determined it was appropriate. She was 12 years old. Part 6, Betty Bell. What was happening in the house on the street in Scotswood that no one in the courtroom was allowed to hear? Betty Bell was Mary's mother. And the story of Betty Bell is, in many respects, the story that the trial of 1968 did not tell. Betty Bell was a woman whose own history was complicated and difficult. She had worked, at various points, as a prostitute. She had relationships with multiple men. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her and later documented her, a woman who was herself the product of a damaged history. This is not offered as an excuse for what she did. It is offered as context. Because in the story of harm passed from one generation to the next, Betty Bell was not a point of origin. She was a relay. Mary Bell was born in May 1957. From the time Mary was 4 years old, and possibly earlier, Betty Bell had been harming her daughter in specific and deliberate ways. The primary form of harm was what would now be recognized as a pattern of fabricated or induced illness, sometimes referred to historically by a different name, Munchausen syndrome by proxy, now more accurately called factitious disorder imposed on another. Betty Bell gave her daughter pills and substances that made her sick. She then presented her to doctors as an inexplicably unwell child. Mary was hospitalized multiple times in early childhood for what were recorded as unexplained overdoses or episodes of illness. There were incidents that looked, to anyone paying attention, like attempted infanticide. Betty Bell, on at least one occasion, attempted to give her infant daughter to a woman she had just met on the street, a woman who would later report that Betty had approached her and tried to press the baby into her arms. There were reports, from various sources, of Betty expressing hostility toward Mary. Of Betty treating her daughter not as a child to be protected but as a burden to be managed, or disposed of, or used. And there was another dimension to the harm. Testimonies gathered years after the trial, compiled by the journalist Gitta Serini for her landmark 1998 book about the case, painted a picture of sexual abuse. Of Betty Bell using her daughter in ways that were profoundly damaging. Of Mary, from a very young age, being exposed to and made part of experiences that no child should be exposed to. None of this was heard by the jury in December 1968. None of this was presented to the 4 psychiatrists who diagnosed Mary as a psychopath. The reasons for this gap are themselves complex. In part, the information was not fully known. In part, the legal culture of the time did not place the same emphasis on childhood trauma as a mitigating factor that a modern court would. In part, Betty Bell herself was not a cooperative source. She denied, minimized, and deflected throughout any inquiry into her conduct. But the gap existed. And the consequence of that gap was that the court, and the public, and history, for decades afterward, understood Mary Bell primarily through the lens of the diagnosis that had been reached without full information. Psychopath. A child who killed for no comprehensible reason. A child who was simply, essentially, wrong. Gitta Sereni spent years building a relationship with Mary Bell, interviewing her extensively as an adult, and also researching the circumstances of her childhood. What Sereni found, and documented in her book Cries Unheard, was a picture of sustained, severe, multi-layered abuse that had begun in infancy and continued throughout Mary's early childhood. The kind of abuse that developmental psychologists now understand to be among the most damaging things that can happen to a developing child. The kind of abuse that disrupts attachment, dysregulates emotion, distorts the understanding of what other people are and what they feel, and can produce, in extreme cases, exactly the kind of presentation that the psychiatrists in 1968 had interpreted as innate psychopathy. This does not mean that Mary Bell was not responsible for what she did. The legal system, even with all its limitations, reached a conclusion that acknowledged her reduced responsibility, not no responsibility, but reduced responsibility. That conclusion, arrived at without the full picture, may have been more accurate than the court knew. What it does mean is that the story of what happened in Scotswood in the summer of 1968 is not complete, was never complete, without the story of what was happening in Mary Bell's home. Part 7. What the abuse did. How does what happens to a child in private shape what that child becomes in public? This is the most difficult part of the story to tell, and to hear. It requires a particular kind of careful thought. Because the territory we are entering is one where it is easy to make errors in either direction, to be so focused on what Mary Bell did that we refuse to consider what was done to her, or to be so focused on what was done to her that we minimize the deaths of 2 little boys who had nothing to do with any of it. Both of those errors are errors. Both of them cost us something. The first costs us the truth of a child's life. The second costs us the truth of 2 other children's lives. The only honest path is to hold both truths simultaneously, even though they are uncomfortable together. What do we know, from developmental psychology and from the accumulated research of the decades since 1968, about what sustained early childhood abuse does to a developing child? We know that the earliest years of life are the period during which the brain forms its most fundamental understandings. Its understanding of safety and danger. Its understanding of other people as sources of comfort or sources of threat. Its understanding of the self as valuable or not valuable. These understandings are not formed through conscious thought. They are formed through experience, through the patterning of repeated interactions, through what the body learns before the mind has language to process it. When those foundational experiences are characterized by harm, by unpredictability, by a caregiver who is simultaneously the source of the greatest danger and the only available source of any care at all, the developing brain adapts. It adapts in ways that are, from the perspective of survival, intelligent. It becomes hypervigilant to threat. It learns to read the emotional states of others with extreme precision, because that skill is essential for avoiding harm. It may become adept at presenting differently than it feels, because showing your true state can be dangerous. It may develop a damaged or absent capacity for empathy, not because empathy is inherently absent, but because empathy requires a certain fundamental sense of safety, and safety has never been reliably available. These are not character defects. They are adaptations. They are what a child's brain does when the environment it is developing in is profoundly unsafe. In Mary Bell's case, the specific form of the abuse added additional layers of damage. Being made ill deliberately, being hospitalized, being exposed to a caregiver who could present a loving public face while conducting private harm, this creates a particular kind of disconnection between what is visible and what is real. A child raised in that environment learns, at a fundamental level, that appearance and reality are separate things. That the face you show the world does not have to correspond to what is actually happening. That performance and truth are independent of each other. That learning shows up everywhere in the record of Mary Bell's behavior. The smile on the doorstep of Martin Brown's mother. The composure in the police interviews. The calm in the courtroom. The controlled, almost theatrical quality of the notes left in the nursery. These are not signs of a child who was simply born without conscience. They are signs of a child who had learned, very young, that the gap between what you show and what you are is a place where you live. The psychiatrists who evaluated Mary Bell in 1968 were not bad at their jobs. They were working with the knowledge and frameworks available to them at the time. Psychopathy, as a diagnostic category, was the closest available label for what they observed. A child who seemed not to feel what she was supposed to feel. A child who did not respond to social and emotional cues in expected ways. A child who had done something catastrophic and showed no visible signs of the remorse that would make that catastrophe comprehensible. What they lacked was the context. Without the context, the observed characteristics pointed toward a fixed and internal deficiency. With the context, those same characteristics look very different. They look like the result of something external. Something that had been done, deliberately, to a child who had no capacity to resist it and no way to understand it. This is not a comfortable realization. It is tempting to prefer the simpler story. The story of a child who was simply wrong, intrinsically and fundamentally. That story allows us to contain the horror. It allows us to say, this was a unique aberration. This was not something that implicates the systems and people around her. This was just her. But the evidence does not support that simpler story. And the people who have spent the most time with the full record of this case, the researchers, the psychologists, the journalists like Gitta Sereni who went where the discomfort is, have arrived, almost uniformly, at the same conclusion. That Mary Bell was a deeply damaged child who did terrible things. And that the damage and the terrible things were connected. Part 8, The Years of Detention. What does it mean to try to rehabilitate a child who was never given the chance to form properly in the first place? Mary Bell was 12 years old when she was sentenced. She was held initially at a remand home, then moved through a series of secure institutions as the authorities grappled with what to do with her. There was no established protocol for a case like hers. The institutions designed for young offenders were not designed with her in mind. The early years of her detention were characterized by significant difficulty. She was sometimes aggressive. She was sometimes withdrawn. She was, by various accounts, manipulative in her interactions with staff and other residents, though it is worth pausing on that word, manipulative, and asking what it means in the context of a child whose primary survival skill had been the ability to manage and navigate the people around her. There were also, according to later accounts, periods of genuine engagement with education and therapeutic work. Mary was intelligent. She learned quickly. She responded, at least in certain contexts and with certain people, to approaches that took her seriously and tried to understand rather than simply manage her. She was moved, in her teens, to a more open institution. This was not without incident. There were episodes that raised concerns. There were periods of genuine progress. The picture that emerges from the fragmentary record of her detention years is of a young person who was extraordinarily difficult to help, not because she was incapable of change, but because the damage she had sustained was so deep and so early that the interventions available could only reach so far. Betty Bell, her mother, continued to feature in her life during this period. Betty's visits to her daughter in detention were, by various accounts, deeply problematic. There were reports of Betty behaving in ways that were harmful, not overtly, not in ways that prison staff could easily categorize, but subtly, in the grain of the interactions, in the things said and the things implied. The institution's capacity to protect Mary from her mother was limited by the legal and social assumptions of the time. A mother's right to see her child was not something that could be easily overridden, even in circumstances that gave serious cause for concern. The question of when, and whether, Mary Bell should be released was revisited periodically as she moved through her teens and into her early 20s. The assessments of her during this period were mixed. There was genuine uncertainty about the risk she posed. There was also, as the years passed and the nature of her childhood became gradually better understood, a growing body of professional opinion that her original diagnosis had been incomplete, and that her trajectory since conviction suggested something more amenable to change than the label of psychopath implied. Mary Bell was released from detention in 1980. She was 23 years old. She had spent 11 years in various forms of custody. She was released into a form of anonymity, moving to a different part of the country, beginning a life under a different identity. She was not, however, left entirely alone by history. The case of Mary Bell was too significant, too unusual, too laden with unresolved questions, to simply be allowed to recede. Journalists periodically attempted to locate her. Her whereabouts were revealed on at least one occasion, forcing her to move again. The tension between her right to rebuild a life and the public's sense that they had some claim on her story would remain unresolved for decades. Part 9: The Question of Identity. When a child has done something that defines them in the eyes of the world, can they ever become someone different? And do they have the right to try? This is a question that British law has grappled with explicitly in several high-profile cases involving children who committed serious crimes and were subsequently released as adults. It is a question about the relationship between identity and history. About whether a person is permanently and irrevocably defined by the worst thing they have ever done, particularly when they did that worst thing as a child. The British legal system has, in principle, a clear position on this. A child who commits a crime and serves their sentence has, at the end of that sentence, the same rights as any other citizen, including the right not to have their past identity continuously exposed. The Court of Appeal granted Mary Bell a lifetime anonymity order, one of the very few such orders ever granted in England and Wales. This order prohibits the media from publishing any information that would identify her current whereabouts or the new identity under which she lives. The anonymity order has been tested repeatedly. In the late 1990s, the publication of Gitta Sereni's book Cries Unheard created enormous controversy, not only because of its content, but because Mary Bell had cooperated with Sereni and had received a payment for that cooperation. This fact became its own separate controversy. The families of Martin Brown and Brian Howe were, understandably, deeply distressed. The idea that Mary Bell could profit, in any form, from the story of what she had done to their children was extremely painful. This is a legitimate source of pain. And it sits in tension with another legitimate consideration, the fact that the full story of what happened in Scotswood in 1968, including the story of what happened to Mary Bell in her own home, is a story that has significant public interest. Not prurient interest. Public interest. Because the questions it raises about how we understand childhood violence, how we understand the role of parental abuse in shaping a child's capacity for harm, and how we design systems to intervene earlier and more effectively, those questions matter. They matter beyond the specific individuals involved. Gitta Sereni's position, expressed clearly in Cries Unheard, was that the truth required telling. That to continue to discuss Mary Bell as though her diagnosis of psychopathy was the complete and final answer, as though the question of what had happened to her was irrelevant, was to perpetuate a misunderstanding that had real consequences for how society thought about dangerous children and what could be done to help them. The families of the victims had every right to feel differently. Their children were dead. No amount of contextual understanding brings dead children back. And the suggestion that understanding the perpetrator is important can feel, to people who have lost someone to violence, like a minimization of the loss. Like the perpetrator's story is being elevated over the victim's story. What we can say, carefully and with appropriate humility, is this. Martin Brown and Brian Howe were real children. They had families who loved them and futures that were taken from them. Their deaths were real losses, and the pain of those losses did not end with the verdict in December 1968. It continued. It continues still, for the people who were left behind. And Mary Bell was also a real child. A child to whom something was done, deliberately and repeatedly, that damaged her in ways that the court of 1968 never fully understood. That damage does not excuse what she did. It does not restore Martin Brown or Brian Howe. But it is part of the truth. And the truth, in its fullness, matters. Part 10, The Families. How does a family carry a loss that is, in its particulars, unlike almost any other loss? We have spent a great deal of time tonight with the perpetrator and with the investigation. It is important to spend time, now, with the families. June Brown, the mother of Martin Brown, opened her door one afternoon in the summer of 1968 to find an 11-year-old girl asking to see her dead son in his coffin. She slammed the door. She had no way of knowing, in that moment, the full significance of what had just happened. She knew only that it was wrong. That it was cruel. That it was outside the boundaries of anything she had a framework to process. June Brown's loss was compounded by the particular circumstances of her son's death. For weeks, she did not know that Martin had been murdered. She buried him without knowing. She lived with a kind of grief that was already enormous, and then learned that it had a dimension she had not been allowed to understand. That her son had not simply died, he had been killed. And then she sat through a trial in which the details of her son's death were presented publicly, in a courtroom, as evidence in a legal proceeding. The family of Brian Howe experienced a different version of the same impossible situation. Their son had walked out of the front door to play and had not come back. The particular horror of a child simply not coming back, the waiting, the searching, the moment when waiting and searching becomes something else, is a specific kind of anguish. And then the discovery. And then the investigation. And then the trial. Both families were present in Newcastle in December 1968 as the trial unfolded. They were not the focus of proceedings, in the way that modern trials sometimes attempt to center the experiences of victims' families. The legal culture of the time was not oriented that way. The trial was about guilt and responsibility, conducted according to legal procedure, and the families were largely peripheral to that process even as it concerned the most central people in their lives. The decades that followed the trial brought additional difficulties. The repeated re-emergence of the case in public discourse, through books, through television documentaries, through newspaper retrospectives, meant that the families were periodically confronted with the story of their children's deaths all over again. Each resurgence brought renewed attention, renewed questions from journalists, renewed engagement with a pain that they had been trying to live alongside for years or decades. When Cries Unheard was published in 1998, both families spoke publicly about their distress. About the sense that the publication of Mary Bell's account, and the payment she had received, was a further violation. The response to those statements, from various quarters, ranged from sympathetic to dismissive, and the families were placed, again, in the position of having to assert the validity of their own pain in a public debate about their own children. Martin Brown was 4 years old. He walked to a sweet shop and bought a piece of candy. That is who he was on the last afternoon of his life. A 4-year-old buying candy. Brian Howe was 3 years old. He stepped out of his front door to play in the summer afternoon. These are the facts that must not be lost in the complexity that surrounds this case. They were children. They were small and trusting and had no part in any of the forces that converged on their short lives. They were not variables in a theory about childhood trauma and violence. They were children. And they deserved to grow up. Part 11, Cries Unheard, the full picture emerges. What changes when we finally have access to the story that was hidden from the court? Gitta Serini had been writing about Mary Bell since the time of the original trial. She was a journalist and author of considerable stature. Her work on Albert Speer and on Franz Stangl, two men whose culpability in some of the greatest crimes of the 20th century she had explored with rigorous and uncomfortable depth, had established her reputation as someone willing to engage with questions that other journalists preferred to avoid. Her interest in the Mary Bell case was, from the beginning, shaped by a specific question. Not whether Mary Bell was guilty, that was settled. But whether the story that the court had heard, and that the public had accepted, was the complete story. Whether the diagnosis of psychopathy, rendered without full information, was the right diagnosis. And whether the full truth of what had happened in that house in Scotswood in the years before the summer of 1968 had ever been properly examined. Sereni first wrote about Mary Bell in 1972, in a book called The Case of Mary Bell, published while Mary was still in detention. That book was based on the trial record, on interviews with those involved in the case, and on Sereni's own careful analysis of the available evidence. It was notable for its refusal to accept the psychopathy diagnosis uncritically, and for its insistence that the question of what had happened to Mary needed to be part of any honest account of what Mary had done. The 1998 book, Cries Unheard, went much further. By that point, Mary Bell was an adult. She had been living under a new identity for nearly 2 decades. She had a daughter who did not know her mother's original identity, who had grown up not knowing that her mother was the person described in true crime books and newspaper retrospectives as one of the most disturbing criminals in British history. Mary Bell agreed to speak with Sereni. The conversations were extensive, conducted over a period of time, and covered ground that had never been covered before. They covered the specific nature of what Betty Bell had done to her daughter. They covered the hospitalizations, the deliberate drugging, the sexual abuse. They covered what it had been like to be a small child in a house where the person who was supposed to protect you was the person you most needed protection from. The picture that emerged was not of a child who had been born without conscience. It was of a child who had had her conscience formed in the most distorted possible environment, formed by a mother who modeled harm, who treated the suffering of others as something to be used rather than responded to, who used her own child as an object rather than as a person to be loved and protected. Sereni was careful, always, to maintain the distinction between explanation and excuse. She was not arguing that what Mary Bell had done was forgivable in a simple sense. She was arguing that it was explicable. That an honest account of what happened required the full truth of both the crimes and the context in which those crimes developed. The response to Cries Unheard was, as mentioned earlier, complicated by the revelation of the payment. But the substantive content of the book, the documentation of Betty Bell's abuse, the psychological analysis of its effects, the account of Mary's life before, during, and after the crimes, has been broadly accepted by researchers, psychologists, and legal scholars as representing the most complete picture currently available. What that picture adds to our understanding is this: the 4 psychiatrists who diagnosed Mary Bell as a psychopath in 1968 were not wrong that something was seriously wrong with her. They were wrong about the cause. And the cause matters. Not for the verdict reached by the jury was, given the available information, as accurate as it could have been. But for our understanding. For the lessons that can be drawn from this case. For the way we look at dangerous children, and what we do about them, and how early we try to intervene. A child who is innately psychopathic, if such a thing exists in the pure form that the 1968 diagnosis implied, presents one kind of problem. A child who has been severely and deliberately abused and who has developed, as a result, a profound impairment of empathy and emotional regulation presents a different kind of problem. Not necessarily a less serious one, but a different one. A different one that might, if identified early enough and responded to appropriately, be addressed in ways that prevent harm rather than simply responding to it after it has occurred. The case of Mary Bell does not give us easy answers to that problem. It gives us a very vivid and very painful illustration of what happens when the problem is not identified, not addressed, and allowed to develop unchecked in the most destructive possible environment. Part 12. What remains? What is the legacy of a case like this, 50 years on? And what questions does it leave that we still cannot fully answer? More than half a century has passed since the summer of 1968. The streets of Scotswood in Newcastle have changed. The industries that defined the area have largely gone. The community that existed then exists now in a different form, altered by the same forces of economic change and redevelopment that have altered working-class communities across Britain. The people at the center of this story have aged along with the city. The detectives who investigated the case are mostly gone. The judge who presided over the trial is gone. The psychiatrists who made their diagnoses are gone. Bernard Knight, the forensic pathologist who examined Martin Brown and could not determine a cause of death, continued a distinguished career and eventually retired, carrying with him, presumably, whatever he made of that early case in his later years of understanding. Mary Bell is alive. She is in her late 60s. She lives under the anonymity order that the Court of Appeal granted her. She has a daughter who has now grown up. Her daughter, as an adult, became aware of her mother's identity, and the courts have extended the anonymity order to protect the daughter as well. 2 generations of women living with the consequences of a summer in 1968, consequences that neither of them chose, in quite different ways. Betty Bell is dead. The legacy of the Mary Bell case is distributed across several different domains of public life and professional practice. In law, the case raised fundamental questions about the criminal responsibility of children that continue to be debated. In England and Wales, the age of criminal responsibility is 10, among the lowest in the world. The case of Mary Bell, and, in a later generation, the case of the boys who killed James Bulger in 1993, has forced repeated reconsiderations of whether that age is appropriate, whether children below a certain age can be considered criminally responsible in the same sense as adults, and what the purpose of prosecution and detention is when the defendant is a child. In psychiatry and developmental psychology, the case contributed to a growing body of work on the relationship between early childhood trauma and later violent behavior. The diagnosis of psychopathy in children has become considerably more complex and considerably more contested since 1968. The field has developed a much more nuanced understanding of the ways in which trauma can produce presentations that superficially resemble congenital psychopathy but are, in origin and potentially in trajectory, fundamentally different. In child protection, the case stands as a stark illustration of the consequences of failure to identify and respond to severe parental abuse. The specific form of abuse that Betty Bell inflicted, the fabricated illness, the deliberate poisoning, the use of the medical system as a tool of harm, is a recognized pattern that child protection services now have frameworks for identifying. Those frameworks did not exist in 1968. They exist now partly because of cases like this one. In journalism and publishing, the case of Mary Bell remains a touchstone for discussions about how true crime should be written, who benefits from telling these stories, and what responsibilities journalists have to the living people whose worst experiences become the subject of public narratives. Gitta Sereni's work is both an example of the best that responsible true crime journalism can achieve, and an example of the ethical complications that can never be entirely resolved. And in the broader public consciousness, the case endures because it confronts us with questions that do not have comfortable answers. Questions about what a child is capable of. Questions about what we owe to a child who has done terrible things. Questions about the relationship between what is done to us and what we do to others. Questions about guilt and responsibility and the limits of both concepts when the person we are applying them to was 11 years old and had been systematically harmed for most of the life they had lived by the time the worst moments of that life arrived. The case of Mary Bell does not resolve into a clean moral lesson. It does not offer the satisfying arc of justice done and questions answered. What it offers, if we are willing to sit with it honestly, is something more valuable and more difficult than that. It offers an accurate picture of complexity. Of the ways in which harm compounds. Of the ways in which children need protection not just from strangers but from the people closest to them. Of the inadequacy of simple categories, monster, victim, psychopath, when the reality they are trying to describe refuses to fit inside them. Martin Brown was 4 years old, walking home from a sweet shop on a May afternoon. Brian Howe was 3 years old, stepping out to play on a July evening. Mary Bell was 11 years old, and had been living in a house that was doing things to her that no child should have to survive. All of these things are true. All of them are part of the same story. And the story does not end with any of them. It continues, in legal scholarship and psychological research and child protection practice and public conversation. It continues in the lives of the people who carry it, who are alive, tonight, with versions of it that none of us will fully understand. We owe it to all of them, to Martin, to Brian, to the girl who was once Mary Bell, and to the question of what we might do differently, to hold the full complexity of what happened. Not to collapse it into something simpler. Not to reach for the easy explanation. But to stay with the difficult truth for as long as it takes to really see it. Closing meditation. There is a kind of research that does not let you go when you close the book. This is one of those cases. You can set it aside for the night, and in the morning it will still be there, asking the same questions it was asking when you first encountered it. What did we miss? What could we have seen? What systems failed, and how, and when? And what do we do with the knowledge of all of it, now that we have it? These are not rhetorical questions. They are real ones. They are the questions that make a case like this worth spending time with, even when, especially when, spending time with it is uncomfortable. Martin Brown and Brian Howe deserve to be remembered as the children they were. Small, ordinary, loved, and entirely without blame in any of this. Their names matter. Their lives, brief as they were, mattered. The grief of their families is real and ongoing and deserves acknowledgement every time this story is told. Mary Bell deserves to be understood as fully as our capacity for understanding allows. Not excused. Not celebrated. Not made into a symbol of anything convenient. But understood, in the full and complicated truth of a life that began in circumstances that no child should begin a life in. And Betty Bell, a woman who did terrible things to her daughter and whose story has largely remained in the shadows of the more dramatic elements of this case, deserves to be part of the conversation. Because she is the part of this story that most clearly asks, what could have changed everything? And the honest answer is, early recognition of what she was doing. Earlier intervention. A different response from the systems that were in contact with that family and did not see, or did not act on, what was there to be seen. We know more now than we did in 1968. We have better tools. We have better frameworks. We have better research. Whether we use them well enough is a question that belongs to the present, not the past. Tonight, let this case settle into the part of your mind where difficult truths live. The part that keeps asking questions after the lights go out. Let it rest there, quietly, doing the work that important and uncomfortable stories do. You have stayed with something very heavy tonight. That is its own form of respect. Sleep well, and carry what you've learned gently into the days ahead. If you're still awake after that, subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment. Which case should we cover next?